Rob, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this morning and to talk a little bit about Ralph Waldo Emerson. You were my minister, so this is a bizarre but lovely experience for me to invite you into our congregation. Um,
For
and
me too.
Good, I'm glad. The first question I wanted to ask you is just if you could tell us a little bit. I know you've studied Ralph Waldo Emerson, you've done some academic work, you said you just taught a class on him. What is it that first drew you to Emerson, and what made you want to explore and study his life in more depth?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that question, and thanks for this opportunity to talk about someone who um, is a really compelling figure for me and an important figure in my religious life. Um, so here's when I was first introduced to Unitarian Universalism as a young adult, I was introduced to a tradition that was focused pretty intently on reason and the intellect, and which is part of what drew me to Unitarian Universalism. But I felt something was missing. I felt that there was kind of like a depth of spirit and a quality of seeking and of spiritual seeking that I wasn't finding in the tradition until I discovered, until I got to know Ralph Waldo Emerson. And what Emerson gave to me was this great gift, which is that the idea that God is present everywhere. God is present within us, in nature, in our relationships, and that we can, as he says in the Divinity School address, we can know God without mediator or veil. In fact, he dares us to know God without mediator or veil. And that dare, that invitation, I found exciting, and it just opened up this whole world. I feel like part of what Unitarian Universalism has given me is this idea of the world is shot through with the holy, and let's discover the holy, let's praise it, let's build a just world in honor of it. And it was Emerson who first introduced me to that way of seeing the world, like different lenses on my eyes, you know.
Did you first encounter him reading his work in seminary, or was it in a congregation? Did you hear him preached about, or how did you first meet him?
Yeah. I would say my real introduction to Emerson was Robert Richardson's amazing biography called Emerson, Mind on Fire, which is just a beautiful biography. He's also done biographies of Thoreau, and that's a really great biography as well of Thoreau. But so it was, I was in seminary, so I knew a little bit about Emerson. I'd read him a little bit, but it was Richardson's biography that really makes Emerson come alive for me. And so that's when I started trying to learn more about him and really study his life and what the spiritual practices that formed his life and shaped his life, and that which eventually became kind of part of the work of my my doctoral work.
He was alive in the 1800s for most of that century, right?
Yeah.
And he started his career, I think his father was a Unitarian minister, and then he became a Unitarian minister, and that lasted, what, 3 years?
Yeah, not very long.
Yeah.
His grandfather was a minister too. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
How, we talk about him a lot today as this Unitarian kind of figure of our history and this huge influence. It's interesting to me that he started his life sort of much more closely identified with Unitarianism. Did he continue to identify with Unitarianism throughout his life, or is it more that what he wrote resonated so well that people kind of looked back and brought him into our tradition over time? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot
Was
of
he
sense.
out to influence Unitarianism, I guess, is the question?
Yeah, well, I think he had his sights set broader than Unitarianism. But I think his relationship with Unitarianism was just always complicated, and he saw limits of in the movement, some of the same limits that I spoke about discovering, which is that a little heady, he called it corpse cold, in fact. And so he wanted to breathe some life and blood into it. But he, even after he left the ministry, he remained, he preached a lot in Unitarian churches all of his life. But I think his biggest influence during his lifetime was just his relationships with other Unitarian ministers. He started, he helped shape the Transcendentalist Club, which included a lot of Unitarian ministers. His whole life was surrounded by the Unitarian community. So the idea that he ever left the tradition just doesn't really resonate with me. But his influence, but then you're right, you are right to claim that, like, that his writings after he was a minister have influenced our tradition much more than his ministry in the movement ever influenced the tradition.
Yeah.
In many ways, Emerson's Unitarianism became what Unitarianism. He succeeded in the renovation that he was, in the rehabilitation, or that he was looking for the faith.
That is part of what's always struck me about when I, even before preparing for this conversation, went back to just review some of the basic things I learned about him in seminary and some of my own favorite writings of his, is how natural they feel now to me as a Unitarian Universalist, and how reading them out or describing them to members of my congregation, they go, yeah, of course, that's how we think, that's what we believe. But when he gave the Divinity School address at Harvard, he was criticized and people said it was inappropriate, and he wasn't invited back there for like 30 years or something.
That's right.
I love that I read that address, because now every Harvard Divinity student is required to read that. That's actually one of the required readings of one of the few required courses. That's awesome. I just love the irony of he was not invited back for 30 years, and now every student is required to read his address.
Yep, right. He got what he got the influence that he sought. He
did. So it's spring now, but in the wintertime, in January and February at Wellsprings, we did a message series called Making a Life. And it was all about the Maya Angelou quote, making a living is not the same as making a life. We talked a lot about the role of work in our lives and our professions, and the meaning that we find in our work. So one of the fun exercises for this message series, as we think about what these people would do if they were here today, how they might guide or inspire us, is also asking the question, like, what do we literally think they would do? If you could imagine Ralph Waldo Emerson, like, dropped here in a time machine, what do you think he would do for a living today? Who would he be?
Well, I mean, first I would just say, like, that whole distinction between making a life and making a living is such, like, Emerson was all over that distinction, and it was, and as were many Unitarians back then, believing that, God has created us for something more than just simply making a living. But as for Emerson, I think he did have his vocational crisis, right? He was a minister. He realized that really didn't work out for him, and he became a philosopher and a poet and an interpreter of life. And I think that he found exactly what he was called to do, and would be doing the same thing right now. I sometimes like to think, Emerson was kind of like one of the first big speakers on the, what in the 19th century was the Lyceum circuit, which, if you think about it today, it was like, he was like the original TED Talk. He had created this kind of quasi-secular but still very spiritual kind of space where he was giving motivational addresses to people and finding a huge audience beyond the church, but still preaching the same gospel he had preached in the church, really. So I could see Emerson on the TED tour.
Yeah, what he created was almost like a salon, but also beyond like one gathering, it sounded like. And yeah, it makes me, the YouTuber is probably a little too
yeah. Well, yeah, right. I don't see that.
But longer form than that. Maybe he'd be a podcaster though.
Podcaster, TED talker, public intellectual. Those are things he was already, but yeah, they're just contemporary vehicles for what he was doing. Yeah.
And he was recognized in his time. He was not one of those people who wrote a lot and then later on people started to appreciate it. He was well known, right?
Very well known, very popular speaker all across the country. Yeah.
If you imagine him again, kind of just here in our world today, and knowing what you know about what he cared about most, what do you think he would be proud of to see that might be different from the world he knew?
I think he would be, I think Emerson would be excited to see the ways in which spirituality in America has opened up in different contexts to embrace the kind of, pantheism or panentheism that he espoused. The ways that spirituality in America has broken out of the bounds of denominationalism. I think he would resonate with a group, the movement of people who call themselves spiritual but not religious, although I'm not sure he would have used that phrase exactly. But the kind of free spiritedness of people. I mean, I think by the same token, he would see kind of, the opposing religious movement or, of a kind of fundamentalism or religious conservatism, and he'd see that with real concern. I view it with real concern, but I think he would be delighted by the number of people who find it very natural to say that we encounter the sacred in the natural world, right? Which is something that was a little controversial when he said it, and is now, everyone's, so many people, resonate with that sentiment.
Yeah,
and that was a very Emersonian sentiment. So I think that's something he would be proud of. I think there'd be a lot he'd be concerned about, though.
Well, that's my next question too.
Yeah.
And you already gave one aspect of it, which I think makes sense. This, there has been this movement in America towards the pantheism, panentheism, seeing God in everything, seeing God in nature, feeling like when you go for a hike on a Sunday morning that is church also, and that there's something there that you're connecting to. But yeah, of course, there's a counter movement in our country that has gotten even more specific about, no, it has to be this way, it has to be this faith, it has to be this doctrine. So, and that was one of my other questions, maybe if you want to say more about that or other things also, what do you think would break his heart about the way that we live now?
I think it's hard to answer that question without talking about capitalism. I think, Emerson lived at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution in America. He lived at a time when the railroad arrived in Concord. And it was a very intimate experience and it's a big deal for him and for the people he was close to. The idea, the ways in which they saw industrialism and industrial capitalism taking over more and more people's lives. coming to represent the sum total of how people saw their lives. The ways that capitalism can reduce one's idea of what a human life can be, right? And allow us
what
to,
they're
like,
good for, or what they can
what they're
produce.
good for, what their value is in society, what the purpose of their lives is. Yeah. He saw that starting to shrink, right? And so did Thoreau is especially prescient about this, but so did Emerson. And I think that kind of the ways in which capitalism has seeped into so many aspects of our life would be deeply concerning to him. He was also concerned with, the pace of life. For him, the railroad, he was kind of fascinated with the railroad, but he was also afraid of the railroad and the ways in which the speed of life, would not allow for the kind of reflection that he thought was important for the spiritual life. And I mean, gosh, if he thought the railroad was going to be a problem,
right? Yeah, that's what I was thinking. That escalated quickly, right?
That's right. He's really gone off the charts there.
Yeah.
So I think he, yeah.
I can see how that, putting myself back in his shoes, doing kind of the opposite reflection. Yeah, if I lived in a time before the railroad, I mean, it's a very physical shift of, like, this makes you go faster than it's possible for you to naturally go, right?
That's right.
Like, this makes you move past the world, and the world move past you at a rate that is beyond just our basic human senses.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. And yeah, how much more has that shifted with, we need an answer, we instantly look it up, we want to talk to each other, we video chat,
right.
I wonder how he would feel about just the technology, the information age.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How did he was he critical of industry and transportation and those changes, or did he have mixed opinions about it? Do you know?
Yeah, that's not where a lot of my expertise about Emerson is. I think that Emerson, the critique of capitalism that I've read most in Emerson is its impact on people. Like, so it wasn't as much a systemic critique of an economic system and the ways it was going to reshape society, or even create haves and have-nots, or that might be there, but what comes across most clearly is the ways in which capitalism impacts us, and human lives, and human identity and purpose. And maybe that's something that needs to be lifted up more. I think a lot of critiques of capitalism now are systemic critiques about injustice and about
wealth inequality.
Wealth inequality. All of which is is really important. But sometimes maybe we don't also pay attention to the damaging ways that just this capitalism story about what it means to be human is a diminishing, reductive story about what it means to be human. And that's what he really understood, I think. But Lee, I think I just wanted to add that I think one other thing that might break his heart is that Emerson himself, people have used Emerson to justify capitalism.
Right.
And in some ways, and I think that would break his heart. The Emerson, we have to be careful how we read Emerson. It's easy to read Emerson as a really a rampant individualist.
Right. Self-reliance, right?
Self-reliance, right. Yeah. That's boy, is that a capitalist mythology, right? Like that we're self-reliant people, we're pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and self-made people. And
is that not what he meant?
I think that's not what he meant, but it's easy to read him that way, and sometimes he flat out said it that way, and I think the kind of freedom that he was trying to create for human beings was a spiritual freedom. And but he, even in that context, his image of the human soul, was as a fundamentally like interconnected thing. Like, when he talked about the God within, he was speaking about a piece of us that was something that was connected to everyone else, and that was even and inside of everyone else. And so, in the metaphor, of course, he used for that was the oversoul, right? We each have a little bit of soul within us, and that soul is comes from this oversoul that connects all of us. And oftentimes we don't read Emerson. We read Self-Reliance without the oversoul, when they're both really important sides of it. But capitalists have used Emerson's individualism to justify that ideology in America, for sure.
Right. This idea that we shouldn't need or rely on each other, that interdependence is weak, that independence is strong, all of those mythologies.
That's right. That any impediment of my own freedom is wrong. Yeah, right.
I hadn't thought about that, but that rings true to me, that Emerson's work was, I can see, correct me if you think I'm misstating this, but I can see how Emerson's work is in many ways very personal and not very systemic. He really didn't it makes sense. He was a philosopher and a religious person, and not thinking about government systems or economic systems nearly as much as he was thinking about how are we as humans, how are we restricted as humans by society? How can we more fully develop ourselves in that divine sense that we have that piece of God in us?
Yeah. He was mistrustful of institutions, and I think, that's not the healthiest, that's not the healthiest part of, that's an important, that mistrust is, or that skepticism is an important piece to lift up, but yeah, he's not a great, I think, really nuanced thinker about systemic stuff. That's at least my sense. I didn't really read him for that when I went to read him.
Yeah. Well, and he wasn't trying necessarily to be that person who was figuring out how to balance institutions with. He was also responding to his context, where he felt like maybe that was the institutional side was a little too heavy-handed, right? And the
right.
Yeah.
Whether it be Unitarianism or right.
You mentioned a couple times it's come up, kind of his sense of connection to nature and spirituality in nature. This perhaps was not something on anyone's radar at the time that he was alive, but now more and more of us are accepting that we're seeing climate collapse happening all around us in real time. If he were here today, do you think he'd be talking on that, speaking on that? Do you think he'd be an activist? Do you think he'd be trying to change things? How do you think he would interact with climate change?
Yeah. I think that good question. What I can imagine is what I know of his writing and his life, which is that his greatest value to us might continue to be lifting up our connection to the natural world, our interdependence with the natural world, the idea that the natural world is sacred. I don't see Emerson. Emerson was never a movement builder. He was a reluctant participant in various causes. never an institutionalist. He'd often show up to speak about stuff, and sometimes could be a very effective voice for causes. And I could see him playing that role as kind of a philosopher of nature right now. But I don't see him manning the or peopling the front lines necessarily.
He
Yeah.
wouldn't be the head of Greenpeace or anything like that. He would
No,
be,
no,
yeah.
or certainly not the sun,
Yeah.
the sun sunrise revolution or the sunrise
Right.
movement. Um, I think also his heart, it would be heartbreaking for him to see, for him, the natural world represented in abundance and um, so to think about the limits of that world, I think it would have had it would have created maybe a crisis of faith for him as well.
Mm-hmm. Imagining that we could destroy something that he saw so closely connected to God as humans.
Yeah. Yep.
Mm.
And again, he saw the first wave of that destruction, and he was susceptible definitely to like manifest destiny and that a lot of those tropes. I mean, he wasn't but I think he and Thoreau both they saw what that railroad track did as it cut through their the woods behind their where they lived, and the gash that it created and the debris that it left in its wake, and it was an early glimpse on a much different scale.
I wonder, would have been interesting to have Emerson or Thoreau around during the early days of COVID-19 when there were so many of those photos and images of kind of nature taking over again, cities emptied of cars. And I think there was a photo of Los Angeles with no smog whatsoever because every exhaust producing vehicle for the most part was off the roads for weeks. And the resilience of nature too in those moments, if we could see it, if we could honor it. Yeah.
Right. Well, there's also, when you talk about the pandemic, the presence of death was was a reality for Emerson too. And I sometimes think about during the pandemic, I often came back to that side of Emerson. He lost both his first wife and his 5-year-old son to tuberculosis. And like everyone in the 19th century, just lived with the sense of mortality that was just closer to what we experienced in the pandemic, like an intimate sense of mortality.
Might be a way that we can connect back with him.
Yeah.
If he were here again, I've asked you about a couple of different issues, but just imagining Emerson as kind of a present day podcaster and public intellectual and presence. Do you think that the teaching he would want to leave us with in these times would be similar to what he was primarily known for in the 1800s? Like what do you think might feel most urgent or vital or important to him to leave us with now if he were speaking today?
One of the other things that I was drawn to early on from Emerson is his faith in humanity. Which comes from his Unitarianism, right? I mean, the sense of the worth and dignity of human beings, of the divine potential of human beings. I think that's much harder in this day and age for even progressive people to hold that sense of the power and possibility of humanity. I think, in fact, the climate crisis has shifted a narrative that we have around human power and possibility, where human beings are cast, as perpetrators of ill, of destruction rather than possibility. And I think Emerson would want to remind us that the only way we're going to get out of this mess is if we summon our better angels and actually believe that we can summon them and that we can make a difference. And so he would be, I think he'd be trying to rally us to that possibility and to discover that within ourselves again. And I think that's an important message right now. I think a lot of us find it hard to have that faith today.
Yeah. What hope is hard to find these days. And we do spend a lot of time talking about how much potential for destruction and how much we're seeing that unfold all around us. Yeah. And I think that makes perfect sense that he would be able to probably show us very eloquently, with all that potential for destruction, imagine if we actually turned things around and used that power to make things better.
Yeah. I'm thinking, I'm still, my head is still a little bit back in our conversation about the pandemic, Lee. And the night that Emerson's son, Waldo Jr., died of tuberculosis, Emerson wrote a letter to his friend Margaret Fuller, and he wrote, "Will I ever dare to love anything again?" This very tender and heartfelt cry of the soul, right? And he goes through a process in that grieving process, and comes out of on the other end and essentially says, yes, I'll dare to love again. And I feel like that question is very much a real question for us right now, coming out of the pandemic, or just, coming out of the multiple losses in our world and our lives. Our hearts have been broken, and we have to summon whatever strength we have to dare to keep loving the world and to love one another and reach back out to one another. And so I lately, that's the line from Emerson, or the idea from Emerson, that dare to love again, that's been really present with me.
That's very comforting, I think, to hear, because I think I have heard people, and I have felt, can I dare to trust again, to trust my neighbors, we have talked about that at Wellsprings this year too. Loving even this world was one of our other message series, looking around at all of this. How do we dare to love
how
this
do we
world?
Dare to love? Yeah. Right.
And it took time, but he found it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Rob. I'm going to go back and read more Emerson. This is made me want to expand beyond the parts I know best of him. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate this.
Thanks for the opportunity, Lee. It's really nice to spend time with you.
Same.
And with the congregation.